right. Last we left off, tensions were increasing to the point of war between the colonists and the British. Now we delve right into the turning points of the war. Fort Ticonderoga. At Fort Ticonderoga, we are going to see the Patriots surrender the fort to the British. And when they surrender the fort to the British, this is going to allow the British to feel like they can continue to move towards Albany. The goal that is revealed at Fort Ticonderoga is that the British want to separate the New England colonies from the rest of the colonies. The New England colonies were really kind of the moneymaker. This is where you're going to have major ports that the colonists import to, and the British believed that if they could cut New England off from the colonies, that the war would stop. At Bennington, we are going to see a major shift in the war. Burgoyne, who was on the side of the British, is going to dispatch German troops to take over a supply center in Bennington, but the German troops were captured by the Patriots. Burgoyne called upon the allies of the British, which were the Loyalists and Native Americans, to help at Bennington, but that help never came. And what is shown through Bennington is that the support for the Redcoats, the allies that the British thought they had, starts to fade. Now, the major turning point of the war is the Battle of Saratoga. Burgoyne was thinking that he was headed towards taking Albany, but he was faced with some serious Patriot resistance at Saratoga. The British here are going to be very weak, and they are therefore easily defeated by the Patriots. This Patriot win inspires them to continue. They needed this win under their belt to say, we could really turn this thing around. We could defeat the British. Saratoga is also monumental because the Patriots gain a friend. Initially, the French had been a silent ally of the Patriots. They had always had this kind of underlying rivalry with the British Empire, and in the Revolution, they saw their chance to weaken a rival, an old enemy. So the French had been silently supporting the colonists, secretly shipping arms and ammunition to them, but not outwardly fighting with them. The French Navy is where the French are really going to support the Patriots against the British. The Patriots did not have a navy, not one that could compete against the British Empire, but the French did. And after Saratoga, with the Patriot win, the French see the Patriots as a real competitor and are willing to step out and step in with the Patriots against the British, moving this war one step closer to the end. The real end to the war is going to be seen at Yorktown. The French Navy fleet is going to fight against the British by sea. The French, paired with Washington, are going to fight against the British by land. And with this combination of the French in the waters and the Patriots and the French by land, the British are going to be completely surrounded and Cornwallis will be trapped. On October 18th, Cornwallis is going to surrender because he knew he could not get past the French and the Patriots. And with this surrendering at Yorktown, it cannot be neglected that without the French, this surrender probably wouldn't have happened. The war could have gone on for a lot longer had the French not stepped in to help. The Treaty of Paris in 1782 is going to represent the British want to end the war and to establish peace. What needed to happen and what does happen is the recognition of American independence. And what gets drawn up at this Treaty of Paris is new boundaries for this newly independent United States. And the new boundaries you can see in the map are represented in the green, and there are some pretty generous boundaries to the now Americans. Here, though, the French are completely left out of the negotiations, and like I just said, the French were pretty monumental in ending the war. The loyalists who had been loyal to the British crown are going to have some difficulties returning back to their homes now that the patriots, the now Americans, have won. The real problem here is that Native Americans had no protection in any form from the expanding, now 13 United States. This territory was awarded to the United States, but the Native Americans, as they have in the past, were again left out of the negotiations and their land was given away again. The revolution in the colonies is going to spark revolution and revolutionary ideas around the world. African Americans are going to start to push for freedom, something that is going to come up, and as we've already discussed, in this formation of early government. The question of what does slavery look like? Many states in the North are going to enact emancipation, but it's not a countrywide idea. The principles of revolution, that idea that it could be done and it can be done successfully, are going to spread around the world. The French Revolution is going to take place in 1789, and they will cite American precedents saying it was successful in America, maybe it'll be successful here. And the French Revolution is proof that Thomas Paine was correct. In Thomas Paine's Common Sense, when he tells the colonists at the time that they should declare independence and that revolution is inevitable, he predicted also that revolution would be changing the world, that it would spread and revolution would take place in other places if the revolution was successful in the colonies. And he was right, because it does. Once we break away from England, we now have to come up with our own government. And in the very early days, the states are going to draft their own constitutions. Each state comes up with their own form of government. Remember, constitution, the word, means government. So each state came up with their own. In a majority of the states, there's an effort to kind of preserve colonial traditions. Remember those representative forms of government. We had the Virginia House of Burgesses, the New England town meetings. And in those, you saw a representative form of government. That idea is going to be pushed through after the Revolution, calling for a bicameral legislature to create a balance between the wealthy and the common people, and to also push for a strong governor at the state level because we needed some form of leadership. There are going to be many patriots who want equal rights to all tax-paying men. And there are going to be conservative patriots who kind of push for a colonial property requirement to vote. So this idea of who gets to vote and how is kind of planted at the very beginning. And there will be a land requirement to vote for some time, but in the very beginning and for a very long time following, slaves and women are excluded from having voting rights. The Articles of Confederation are going to be the first form of government that we create in the now 13 states. A confederation, the word, is defined as a league or alliance of states that agree to work together, which is exactly what the 13 states were. They were a confederation. So we call the first form of government the Articles of Confederation. The articles reflect the ideas that were presented in the Declaration of Independence. And what that means is they reject a centralized power, they reject a federal government. Instead, they limit power on the Congress, and that power that the Congress had, the centralized power, the federal power of Congress, only included declaring and conducting war, negotiating peace, regulating foreign affairs, and someone to regulate the relations with the Native Americans. So not a whole lot of power there. They weren't given the power to tax. So if they didn't have the power to tax, how would they fight a war? They were allowed to negotiate peace, but who was going to do it for them if there wasn't officials that had the power to do so? And Congress, without the power to tax, relied on the states to contribute to the federal government. And like I said earlier on this year, if I asked you for $1 and I said you can give me $1 anytime you feel like it, would you give me $1? Probably not. It's your money. Why would you give it away if you just to give it away? If you're giving away money, let me know. But that's exactly how the states felt. They weren't just going to give up money. A majority of the states were needed in order to pass a law, even if it was on minor issues. This included declaring war and making treaties. The majority of states that they're talking about here is you needed 7 out of 13 states to pass a single law. That's a lot, and it never happened. Very seldom could you see 7 out of the 13 very different states coming together. In order to change the articles or amend the articles, you needed approval from all 13 states. Now, you want to talk about how a majority was impossible. Complete agreement was even more impossible. The only thing, and I say this and I mean it, the only thing the Articles of Confederation did right, and this is a question on the Regents, the only thing the Articles of Confederation did right was the Northwest Ordinance. There was territory in the Northwest, and in the map it's illustrated in the light green, that we had to make into states. Those were just territories. They weren't outlined. We didn't know how people were going to move out there or what it was going to look like when they did. So the Articles of Confederation designed a technique, an outline on how to organize the territories in the Northwest. They wanted to do this so that they didn't lose the territory to anyone else, because there was a fear that these settlements would turn to a stronger empire like the Spanish or the British for aid. So Congress wanted to define a definite program for managing the territory, which they did. The Land Ordinance of 1785 created a system for dispensing or passing out the public lands. What they said was 1 square mile sold for $1 per acre. So now we have a way to get people to go out there. This is how you purchase it. This is how it becomes yours. The sections favored wealthy landowners for sure, but a system is a system nonetheless. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which is the one I'd put a big old star next to in your notes, provided a government for the Western Territory based on Jefferson's ideas. So we now have a way to get people to move out there, and we have a way to figure out a government for those people. This is huge. This sticks. The only thing we keep from the Articles of Confederation is the Northwest Ordinance. Now, just because we broke away from the British doesn't mean that everything is all hunky-dory, happy-go-lucky. In fact, we are going to run into conflicts with the British and Spain very early on. Trade with Spain is going to be rocky. The Spanish disliked the Americans because they had declared independence, and what that did was threaten their own colonies in Louisiana and Mexico. The Spanish were like, oh my goodness, those colonies just broke away from England. What if ours realized that they could do the same, and they try it? So they really didn't want to trade with the newly independent states. So, to discourage more settlements from moving west and potentially infecting their colonies west of the Appalachian Mountains, the Spanish forbid American trade with New Orleans. They say, nope, you don't even need to come out here because you're not going to be able to trade through New Orleans, which was a huge trading port, and it was very, very important to the colonies to be successful. But the Spanish, they were a little vindictive, and they said, nope, not coming through here. So we kind of had an uphill battle with the Spanish to get them on our sides. The relations with the British were not good. We just beat them in a war, and that's not that great. The British are going to renew the Navigation Acts, and if you remember what that said, it said British ships with British goods are only going to the harbors in these 13 states. And the reason that they say this is because Americans had to pay for the war. They don't want to have that debt, so they put back in place the Navigation Acts. Congress was too weak to coordinate a common front against this British policy, so it went into place. And the British kept their forts on American land, which made it very difficult for the Americans to establish their own independence. The British were around every corner in their forts, being intimidating. And that was something that was set in place by the peace treaty. The British were allowed to keep their forts on American land. And it makes it difficult moving forward to constantly have your enemy around the corner. The Articles of Confederation, their major weakness was in the economy. There was no common currency, so each state was allowed to have its own money. Imagine if you crossed from New York to Pennsylvania and every time you had to change your money over. That's crazy. There actually was no regulation of interstate commerce either. So from state to state, there was no common way to trade. There was no common regulation to trade. As I said earlier, and I've said this multiple times, it's pretty important, there was no way to levy or put into place taxes by the federal government. And because of that, the federal government couldn't pay its debt off. The states were not contributing. The states had the option to contribute, and they chose not to. They just didn't want to. And there was no power there by the federal government to make them do so. The ultimate showing of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation is Shays' Rebellion. In Massachusetts, you are going to see very high taxes be set on the farmers. Now, a lot of these farmers were those who fought in the American Revolution, and upon returning home, they just wanted to go back to their normal life. But they weren't making enough money from their product to pay for their land, to pay the taxes that was being put over their head, the high taxes by the state government. The farmers in turn then were losing their territory, and they were losing their livelihood. So in retaliation to the high unemployment and to the debt and foreclosures that the farmers faced, they're going to lead an armed revolt. One of the leaders is Daniel Shay, where the name comes from. And what the result was is that lawsuits were suspended, and they were suspended until the Depression was lifted and the farmers could really make it out. Other states are going to try to kind of muddy the waters by flooding the state of Massachusetts with paper money, and that doesn't do anything. That just causes inflation. And in Massachusetts, Daniel Shay is going to lead 1,000 farmers to shut down the courthouses because they believed that if the courthouses weren't open, the cases couldn't happen. and then the land couldn't be foreclosed on. And essentially, the farmers thought they would win that way. Um, some of the states, like I said, do suspend the lawsuits, but what it really shows here is the more out of control the rebellion came, the more the farmers challenged the courts, the more they challenged the states, the, 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 the less the states had to push back. And the states, while this doesn't turn into an all out war, the states realized that they needed backing by the federal government to put this rebellion down faster and sooner, and that it wouldn't have grown to the point that it did, and that with federal support, the problems would have been lesser. So this shows us that the federal government needs to be stronger in order to support the state governments, even if that wasn't what we originally wanted after the revolution. Now, this is the end of our Unit 3, and when you come back next time, we'll be reviewing for your test on Unit 2 and 3.